I just don't know.
I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Hello, everybody in the room and on Zoom. It's the second of our full task force meetings. It's not a very robust agenda today. If you look on the very top of the agenda on the second page, I just relisted our task force goals and objectives, just so that we all know where we're coming from and where we're starting from. We've seen these before. Everybody has them. The one change I do want to make right off the top, we're going to have Mike Borges present before we get into the rest of the agenda, just out of respect for Mike's time as a presenter. Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you. Do you need to share your screen?
Yes.
Okay. There we go.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Borges, the Executive Director of the Rural Housing Coalition of New York. We're a statewide membership organization representing rural housing and community development organizations, as well as community planners. And our members are involved in housing development, housing rehab, housing repair, Main Street kind of redevelopment proposals and things like that. So we're sort of one of the main voices for rural communities at the state level in terms of our advocacy, and we'll get to that later. But again, thank you for inviting me. Chris had reached out to me while I was actually on vacation in Charleston and asked me to sub in today. So I just got back yesterday and I had some time this morning to put this proposal together. So it's going to be brief, but I'm here and willing to answer any questions you may have. So get this thing rolling. What is rural New York? That's a good question, because depending who you are, what agency you represent, they have different definitions. USDA defines rural, by county. I think it's like 60 or 65,000 population is defined as rural. I just saw a grant application come in from USDA defining rural as communities of 20,000 or less. So there's a lot of different definitions. We use the state's definition. So the state's Housing Community Renewal Agency, HCR, as it's finally called, defines rural communities as municipalities with a population of 25,000 or less. So 46 out of the 62 counties in the state, so 74% of the counties are considered rural using that definition. They have a majority of their population living in communities of 25,000. 924 of the state's 1,023 communities, or 90% of all the towns and cities and villages, are 25,000 or less. So surprisingly, when you say New York, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is New York City. And I used to live in Ohio. And when I said I was from New York, they automatically assumed I was from New York City. And no, there's an upstate part of the rest of the population lives north of Westchester. So New York is quite rural and has a significant population in that regard. So rural New York's population has declining as well as the whole state, but our decline is a little bit more than the state as a whole. So between 2011, 2015 and the 2016, 2020 American Community Survey census, that's done over a 5-year period each year, or each I guess decennial. And our population loss was 1.3 compared to the 0.8% statewide population loss. So, New York State has a reputation for losing population. I think the latest census showed us losing 300,000 people over that 10-year period. And the population loss continues more significantly, I think, in the rural communities than in urban areas. Again, rural New York has a growing 65 and over population. So our growth during the 2016-2020 period of the American Community Survey was 18.9% compared to a 14.2% growth statewide. So we have a declining population, and then we have an aging population, because how does that happen? Well, you have young people leaving your communities, going into urban areas or out of the state, leaving more older population behind. And here's one of the reasons. Private employment declined 4.7% in the 2016-2020 period compared to a growth of 3.8% in urban areas. So I was interviewed last year by the Times Union, and they were asking me, what about, why is the housing stock, why is that, rural communities losing population? And it's tied to economic opportunity. If there's no economic opportunities for people, they're going to go elsewhere. And so that's why I applauded Mike Tucker and Columbia County for doing their housing study, because you can't do economic development without housing, and you can't have housing with economic development. So I again, kudos to Mike and the team there for doing the housing study last year, which I think I've mentioned before, we actually used in our advocacy efforts with the state legislature to get more funding for rural housing programs. The other troubling thing is the vacancy rate in rural housing is 18% compared to 9% in urban areas. It's kind of difficult to trace where the vacancy rate comes from, but it could be a combination of, again, we have an older, more dilapidated housing stock. So that could be just houses that are just sitting there vacant and uninhabitable. It could be because of Airbnb rentals, where people are not first-time homeowners or current homeowners. It could be a number of different things, but our vacancy rate is twice the level of urban areas. So that's a troubling trend as well. And then, of course, around 78% of our housing is owner occupied compared to 48% in urban areas. So that's kind of the state of rural New York. We actually issued a report a month or two ago called State of Rural New York, which we released to the media and to state policymakers, so they are aware of our issues. And you can find that on our website. Any questions?
78% of owner occupancy versus 48 in rural versus urban.
Yes.
What was the question, Dan?
What's the reason behind that?
Oh, the reason? Well, I mean, again, I think in rural communities it's agricultural, so you're not going to have rental properties typically, and most homes that were built in rural communities tend to be for farmers or merchants or townspeople, and I mean, so the way the population grew lent itself to owner occupied housing as opposed to rental housing. You didn't have huge immigrant influxes like you did in New York City and other urban areas where those populations went into tenement housing, the old tenement housing. So, and plus, again, lack of infrastructure. So it's a nice segue because one of the reasons why we have a struggle in building new housing in rural areas is a lack of infrastructure, whether it's water, sewer, or even broadband. Broadband became a hot button issue, especially during the pandemic when people had to drive to their local libraries or town halls and to get broadband service so their kids could go to school. So so lack of infrastructure in rural communities is a stumbling block to housing development or any kind of development in a rural community. Capacity. So again, that's an issue I think across the board in terms of local government as well as local nonprofits. They tend to be smaller, don't have as deep of staff, and in terms of having their own planning departments or planners on staff or housing specialists. You guys are fortunate that Columbia County has invested in that. But most municipalities, I think, I don't know, just like Valencia or Kinderhook or is it Germantown? No, it's not Germantown, but what's the community just south of Kinderhook? Stuyvesant, yeah. I mean, I don't know if those communities actually have town planners or not, but so capacity to apply for grants, to implement housing or other kinds of projects, community development projects, is also lacking in rural areas as well. So that's another issue. Zoning regulations tend to be not up to date or lacking in general. Comprehensive plans, I don't know when most communities do their comprehensive plans, but in urban, suburban areas, it's typically done on a 5-year to 10-year basis. So there's that. Again, older housing stock in disrepair, vacancies. Also, you know, a lot of the pre-existing existing housing stock in rural communities is in danger of being lost. So there's two big chunks of rural housing, affordable housing in danger. One is the USDA 515 program. So back in the 1990s, the USDA funded nationwide rental housing, affordable rental housing across the, you know, the whole country. And New York has a large chunk of that. There's like 405 USDA properties representing around 22,000 properties or 22,000 units. And they're all located in rural communities. Their mortgages are expiring after 30 years, and those properties have the potential to go off the affordable rental list and into the marketplace, or, you know, redeveloped for something else. So they are in danger of being lost, rental properties. And then, of course, mobile home parks are being scooped up by investors and speculators, and they're forcing rents to go up in these mobile home parks, or they're just basically terminating the leases and forcing people to, you know, be evicted, and they're being redeveloped into something else. So those two chunks of rural housing are in danger currently, and things are only going to get worse. And then, of course, there are very few programs actually targeted to assist rural communities. And that's one of the things that we've been advocating for with the state legislature, is getting funding specifically for rural New York, because it's very hard to compete sometimes for various programs that are out there, because one, you don't have capacity, two, we're not competitive enough, and three, you know, there's just a lot more funding streams dedicated towards urban larger projects, where we're looking for smaller projects to do and that are more suitable for rural communities. So that's, I think those are the main stumbling blocks and barriers to development in rural communities. Folks, anybody want to feedback on that?
How do we compare with other states? Because you're talking about the whole state, right?
Yeah, talking about the whole state. Yeah,
right. Like
yeah.
Massachusetts are abutting, you know, because we're Columbia County, so I mean, part of our economy does come from Berkshire County.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know what Massachusetts does, but I was just reading in Vermont. In Vermont, they have dedicated $30 million in their proposed state budget just to build affordable rental projects of 20 units or less. So a state with a 1.4 million population, which is less than the 4 million people who live in rural New York, is dedicating a lot more money to rural housing than our state. So, and then there are other states that dedicate or set aside a portion of infrastructure funding. They do set asides for what they call low-income housing tax credits, LIHTC tax credits. Those are those are kinds of things that go towards building larger, 60, 80, 100 unit rental projects. Again, we have a hard time competing for LIHTC because the investors want to buy something that's larger, invest in something that's larger with more of a return, as opposed to doing a 10 unit or 16 unit or 18 unit rental project. So we're at a disadvantage because not a lot, or not, if not any, projects or programs are dedicated to rural compared to other states.
Thank you.
Oh,
so
got a question in the room from Lisa Galena, Mike.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I'm not in control. Mike, can you go back one slide? There we go.
Can I go back one slide?
One slide.
Well,
now two.
Two. Let me see. I'm not sure if I can do that, but.
Yeah, my question was about, thank you, was about the 515. Is there any initiatives similar to that or coming on after that? Or is that just done and there's nothing similar that's in the works or process in our state?
Yeah, so the USDA, was a federally funded program from the 1990s. In this year's or last year's federal budget, they allocated $70 million nationally to help with the rehab, repair of these properties, as well as the acquisition of some of these properties by nonprofits. So actually, the Rural Housing Coalition is a subcontractor with another national organization called Enterprise Communities to assist nonprofit housing organizations acquire these properties, these USDA 515 properties, and keep them as affordable housing for low to moderate income people. USDA is concerned, we're concerned that as these properties term out of their mortgages and all the restrictions on those properties expire along with the mortgages, the owners are going to could either turn the properties into market rate, they could sell them, do something else with them, whatever. So they lose their protections, they lose their affordability. And that's a big concern because there's so many of them in New York. There's like 400 spread out across New York State. So again, comprising, I think it's 22,000 units. So yeah, so the state doesn't have anything comparable to that. And there's very little federal funding to preserve them, which is a shame because it's cheaper to preserve what we have than build new. So that's why we have a concerted effort to try to see if we can preserve both the mobile home parks as well as these 515 properties.
Like, I want to circle back just to kind of connect Tim's question with something that you mentioned earlier about the lack of capacity in rural areas. So in Massachusetts, I happen to know this because I worked in the Berkshires directly before I came here. There's no county government in Massachusetts, right? You've got a sheriff and maybe a coroner, and that's pretty much the extent of county government. So the state makes available, it's a program called Local Technical Assistance. It's a pot of money that goes to any regional planning association that exists, especially in rural areas. And the towns, the constituent towns in the Berkshires would send in a local technical assistance application every year. And that funded almost all of their planning efforts. None of those towns have, there are 2 planners in all of the Berkshires, one in Pittsfield and one in North Adams, or 3, excuse me, there's one in Great Barrington. And that's 28 communities, right? 28 cities and 2 towns, or 28 towns and 2 cities. So there's a chunk of money that the state makes available to RPAs every single year. That money gets applied for by the constituent towns that the RPA serves. And then it's mostly consulting work. So there isn't a lot of direct assistance for actually developing housing, but there's quite a bit of capacity building assistance that comes from the state.
Yeah, so funny you say that because that's a nice segue into what the executive and the governor's budget proposals, when she released it back in January, there were 2 things in there that we actually asked for. One was money for planning to help communities do comprehensive plans or housing needs assessments like Columbia County did, because again, you were fortunate that you had the resources to do your housing needs assessment. Many communities don't have those resources or the capacity to do that. So we applauded the governor's putting in 20 million. It's not a lot, but 20 million something for zoning or planning changes. We're hoping to expand that to include housing needs assessments, because it's hard to figure out where you want to build housing without knowing, what the needs are and where. So, so we applauded her for that. It's sort of like what you're talking about in terms of what happens in Massachusetts in terms of grants. I believe HCR would administer this grant program to communities who would apply for the money to do that kind of stuff. There's also, in the governor's proposal, there was 250 million for infrastructure. Again, we asked at least for 10% of that be allocated to or reserved for rural communities. The legislature has done, released their one-house budgets, and both have increased that amount of money for infrastructure. We'll see what happens in the final budget, which supposedly could get done this week. So we won't have long to wait. But the housing compact, and you may have read about this in the newspaper or seen it on TV, whatever, the governor proposed mandated growth goals, housing development goals for municipalities. It was 1% over 3 years for upstate, 3% downstate. There's a lot of blowback, particularly downstate, because they already have density there issues, overcrowding and things like that, and to build that much housing would be a real hardship for them. And I pointed out to legislators in the governor's office, we don't have a problem with exclusionary zoning. We don't have a problem with NIMBYism as much as you do perhaps in suburban areas. What we have a lack of is capacity. Capacity to develop the properties. We don't have the funding for them. The lack of infrastructure. I mean, those are the real obstacles to building housing in rural communities. So, and her housing, the executive proposals didn't address any of those. So we were kind of disappointed, and we pointed that out. I think the legislature has, as of today, has rejected majority of what the housing compact and the governor wanted, and are looking at doing something post-budget. You know, we'll see what happens by this Friday, this weekend. We'll see what's in the budget. We did ask for a number of different things for rural housing needs, and I'll just segue into that. We asked for an increase in the rural preservation program. So that's money that goes to nonprofit housing organizations. So there's about 58 currently of these rural preservation companies located throughout the state. We're hoping to get to 60 of these rural preservation program organizations. $4 million for access to home. We asked for a $3 million increase in that. And that funds accessibility improvements for seniors and disabled homeowners. Again, because we have such a huge population of seniors in rural communities. We have $6 million, we asked for $6 million for Restore. That's another state program that funds emergency repairs to owner occupied housing for low to moderate income seniors. We got an increase last year from, I think it was 1 million to 3.4, and the response was overwhelming. They actually got $6 million worth of requests. So this year we're asking for 6. And then lastly, we're asking for $20 million for the Small Rental Development Initiative, SARD. So last year we got $7 million in there. They just sent out the RFP a couple months ago for this, and this goes towards building or rehabbing small rental projects of 5 to 20 units. And this came directly out of Columbia County's housing needs assessment, because in your study, you said that rental projects could only be around 18 units or less because you don't have infrastructure, or they don't, that's the right size for rural communities. So we took that number, we kind of tweaked it to 20, but that, the whole concept for that came out of how Columbia County did. And we're hoping to get some more money this year to build more small rental projects, 2 units to 20 units, basically, in rural communities. So questions on this?
Yes.
On the small rental development initiative, why was the cutoff 5 as opposed to 4?
Well, HCR came up with the parameters. So the language for the program in the state budget just said 20 units or less. And HCR, when they came up with their parameters for the grant program, picked 5. We're advocating for 2 because what we want to do is do scattered site. So you could do a 2-family house, 2-family house, 2-family house, and qualify for the SARD money. And again, it could be for rehab, acquisition, or construction. So we actually have a bill that we've introduced, and Senator Michelle Hinchy, who I think maybe your state senator, has introduced the bill along with Carrie Warner, who represents Saratoga County. So we're tweaking the program some more, and we hope to get the legislation passed, assuming that the legislature funds it at $7 to $20 million again in this year's budget.
Active rural preservation group in Columbia County.
Did somebody ask a question?
Yeah, Supervisor Adams is wondering if we have an active rural preservation group in the county.
Yes, the Galvin Foundation in Hudson has been designated an RPC. They've been around for a number of years, I guess, well, at least 5 or 6 years. They're relatively new, but they were the designated RPC. You have to apply. So when there's an opening, HCR sends out an RFP, and housing organizations apply for nonprofits apply for the housing designation, the RPC designation. So recently, one RPC closed in Washington County, and another organization applied in Warren County and got the designation. So there are parts of the state that don't have RPC coverage. Across the river, you also have Rubco. And then I think south of you, there's also one in Dutchess County in Poughkeepsie. So
Do they have defined territories?
yes, they do have defined territories. If you go to our website, under resources, you'll see there's a directory of RPCs, and each RPC has a map that goes with it.
And would the website also include information about what projects have been funded by our local RPC over the history of their?
No.
And can you give us a list of those projects?
Just so that we have examples of what kinds of projects have been funded.
If HCR on their website has listings of which projects have been funded over the last couple of years, I'll send Chris the link to that and he can forward that to everybody on the task force.
Yeah. Mike, just one point of clarification. I think that we have been told that even though Galvin is Columbia County's designated rural preservation program, that we can work with anyone that is a certified program in the state.
Oh, yeah,
irrespective
yeah.
of location.
Yes, that is correct. Yes. Yeah. You don't have to work with whatever organization it's there. I mean, I don't know if Galvin covers the whole county even. I have to look at their map, but yes, no, that doesn't prohibit you from working with RUPCO or any other housing organization. You know, there's Hudson River Housing too, that operates, I think, in your area. You know, they're just not an RPC. They don't have to be an RPC for them to do housing. So, so you have lots of choices to work with various organizations to do housing in your area.
Dennis, did you have a question?
I just had a related question. With HCR's definition of 25,000 or less, that means Hudson is a rural community?
If they have a population of 25, I'm not sure what Hudson's population is, but yeah, yes, if they're,
Slightly smaller.
6,500. So it's not a matter of density.
It's not density based. Yeah.
yes, yeah. So that's why Galvin does a lot of its projects, I think, in the city of Hudson, because Hudson qualifies on its own as a, you know, rural community.
And they have infrastructure.
And they have infrastructure. Yeah, that's why I was pointing out to the legislature. I go, you know, you're trying to solve a problem in urban, suburban areas. They don't have an issue with infrastructure. Rural communities have a problem with infrastructure. So you should dedicate more of that money for rural communities, because we're the places that lack the water, sewer, and particularly broadband that are obstacles to building more housing and as well as attracting employers.
May I ask another question about infrastructure? How did you, what were the discussions like regarding infrastructure for scattered sites developments? Were the challenges providing state aid for infrastructure on individual privately held properties? I mean, would small investments in small systems be something the state would be willing to discuss?
I don't know. Again, the parameters of this infrastructure fund have not been finalized. So the state budget hopefully will be done by this weekend, and we'll have more details on whether and how and who qualifies for this infrastructure funding. So I don't have an answer for that now, but I think one of the reasons why we pushed for SARDI and why you in your housing needs assessment, you know, had 18 units or less, is that you could do a small rental project with well water and with septic, you know, of 10 units, 15 unit or smaller sizes, where you don't need to have the actual added costs of the infrastructure. So, I mean, that is, again, is a stumbling block to building new subdivisions, I think, also in rural communities. You know, we've talked to folks in the legislature about funding, using land banks to accumulate property, land, turning them over to housing developers, nonprofit housing developers, who then would contract with a private sector company to build sort of like modular housing. And then that a nonprofit would apply for state funding, or the municipality would apply for state funding to put in the infrastructure, because some of the costs that make building housing not realistic or unaffordable is infrastructure costs. You know, putting in the roads, putting in the water and the sewer and all that kinds of stuff makes building entry-level homes cost prohibitive. I mean, that's one of the issues we are facing, is that no private sector developers are building entry-level homes, starter homes. And that's what we have a scarcity of, is those entry-level homes. And that's why people are stuck in their apartments because there's no home to go to, even when they could afford it. And so I think one of the ways to remove that obstacle is to lower the cost per unit by getting free land from a land bank by getting state funding to put in the infrastructure. And then you could build a starter home for less than 250, which may be more affordable for a low to moderate income person, or a teacher, or a fireman, or somebody who works in the town. So that's what we're advocating for, is more innovative solutions like that that will foster more affordable housing, or just what we call workforce housing, just for the people who live in your community who work there.
We've got one more question from Supervisor Collins of chat.
Asked, are these slides going to be available?
Yeah, I'll
Mike,
send
can
them.
you send it over to me and
Yeah,
distribute them?
I'll send them to Chris.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just a comment, I think actually you will find a good bit of NIMBYism in some of the rural lands, and the target of that NIMBYism usually is manufactured homes. You are right about some of the larger mobile home parks being bought by larger conglomerates and rents going up extraordinarily high immediately. But I mean, have you seen, I think New York State 2017 passed a law that granted amnesty for manufactured homes on permanent foundations. I don't know if townships are updating their zoning to accommodate that law, because a lot of zoning that you do see relegates mobile manufactured homes to parks themselves. But just a
Yeah, in 2019, the legislature passed a law, the Tenant Stability Act, and it applies to mobile home park residents, where they have now protections against unreasonable or unwarranted increases in their rents, and there are protections provided to them. The only problem is that who enforces that? And so if you don't have local building inspectors, or zoning officers, or planners who somebody can call, it's a lengthy bureaucratic nightmare to get somebody at the state to enforce that provision. So we actually, on our website, we have a mobile home community preservation manual that talks about how to preserve these mobile home parks as affordable options for owner occupied people, residents. And it talks about the Tenant Protection Act and what they can do. And there's grant money from the state to rehab and repair or replace mobile homes that are in disrepair. So there's that. And then also there's a state program to help the mobile home park owners put in infrastructure and do repairs to the outside of the mobile home parks, to make sure that they are, usable by their tenants or the residents. So there's money. There's only $5 million, I think, for each program. Not a lot, but at least there's something.
So we have a Columbia County Fair Housing Officer. Would those tenants be able to go to him? I mean, isn't fair housing the same for mobile home tenants than it would be for anybody else?
Well, yeah, if they are authorized or tasked with that responsibility, that would be, suitable. I think that they should go to somebody locally who can come by and say, yes, you're in violation. I mean, first of all, they may not even know that these mobile home parks are protected by the state's, Tenant Protection Act. So that's one thing. I think we need to educate zoning officers or code enforcement officers about this tenant protection and how it applies to mobile homes and residents there. So I think that's important. But yes, they could be tasked with that responsibility if they know about it and they're up to speed on it.
And how about NYSERDA's programs that are related to manufactured homes? I thought they dropped their replacement unit program that was started just like a couple of years ago. Do you know about that?
Yeah, I mean, I do actually. We have a grant from NYSERDA to do workforce training to housing groups on energy efficiency to make their properties that they own and operate more energy efficient. And I have a long-standing relationship with NYSERDA, but I've not heard of one that's targeted for mobile homes.
I don't know if it actually, they have it in the works, a replacement. Yeah, to replace the entire home, because that's being done in other states.
Yeah, no, that's the one I just talked about. It's not NYSERDA, it's HCR. HCR has a program. It's called the
Right,
Mobile
but
Home.
NYSERDA had their own separate one in the works.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but then it fizzled out for some reason.
Yeah, well, NYSERDA actually is transitioning a lot of its energy efficiency programs for housing to HCR.
Yeah.
So there was they were kind of duplicating each other's efforts, and anyway, so I think there's something in the works to do that, to make HCR more responsible for the energy efficiency programs. There is your proposal in the state budget that all new construction by 2025 or 2026 is going to have to use use electric appliances or be heated or air conditioned with electricity, which may or may not be a problem for rural communities. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of changes coming to deal with climate change and make properties more resilient to climate change, like flooding and things like that.
I'm going to take one more question from Lisa, but just really quickly, I'm going to pop this chat up on the screen, and I'll just read it out since it's so small. This is from Vanessa in Assemblymember Barrett's office. Assemblymember Barrett has a bill that clarifies manufactured homeowner rights regarding rental increases. That's currently on the floor.
Oh, good.
Awaiting a vote. I assume it looks like it's made it out of committee and it's just waiting for a vote.
Yep. There's Assemblywoman Barrett is a great advocate for rural housing issues, and I'm glad she's working on that kind of legislation. We also have another bill that we're working with Senator Hinchy on, that would be like the Mobile Home Preservation Act, and it helps with people who are dislocated. So we're not going to be able to save all these mobile home parks from being redeveloped into something else. So for those folks who get dislocated from these mobile home parks, there'll be some assistance, some funding for them to relocate somewhere else in the community. And we're also looking at some funding to allow for the purchase of the mobile home parks by nonprofit organizations, so that way they would run them and preserve the affordability of these mobile home parks by buying the development rights. So many folks are familiar with open space preservation development rights or farmland preservation rights, where the farmer gets to keep his land, but he can't develop it into a strip mall, or some parkland is the development rights are bought and you can't develop that to something else. We're looking at the same concept to preserve these mobile home parks as affordable housing options. So we'll see what happens with that.
Clarification, earlier you mentioned the number, I think 200,000 or 250,000. Was that your number for an affordable house in this region?
What was the question?
Basically the definition of what an affordable home would be in Columbia County. Lisa mentioned that it was about $200,000 was the number that you kind
Oh,
of.
no, I didn't say that. No, I just said that rural communities are defined as 25,000 by.
Oh, no, the home sales price. So like an entry level home sales price.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're trying to get affordability down to something less than $250,000 by eliminating two of the major costs for home construction: infrastructure costs and land costs. If you remove those two things from the equation, you can bring the cost of a starter home below $250,000.
I'm just thinking like 250,000, 30-year mortgage is going to cost a person approximately $1,800 a month. That's not super affordable for the majority of people that live in this county.
No, it's
Homes sometimes can handle more people, more income. So even though, so like you can have multi-generational families in a starter home. Sometimes that can be important.
And then I don't know, somebody mentioned on this side, but one of the big sticking points is, and Habitat is kind of not sponsoring, but they're keeping a close eye. Habitat is keeping a close eye on legislation right now that caps what your property taxes will be if you're in a subsidized home. That's what really crushes people. So if you buy a subsidized house because you income qualify, but your assessor is still assessing it at what it would be on the open market, you're paying an inflated tax rate. I think that's it. Mike, thank you so much.
Oh, yep. Thank you for having me, and good luck with your efforts. Take care.
Thank you. All right. Yes.
they're developers. So like Meredith asked about people who work in our area. So if you're doing development, we're not tied to ours. So if you're doing development, we have one. But in terms of the specific programs, like down payment assistance, homeowner repair, those are tied to the provider in your county. So you can't go to Go and get down payment assistance for someone in Columbia County and get homeowner repair. So there's a huge menu of programs under those rural preservation programs, and some you can get from other counties and can't.
Okay.
Our surrounding county partners tend to have a more like bigger capacity and more menu of options they offer than Calvin, for a variety of reasons. Some of them is just that you don't necessarily even have houses that would qualify for down payment assistance. Like you have to have houses that are affordable enough to get a person who isn't qualified for down payment assistance. So you can have that available. But just to clarify a little bit more about that. So Galvin has a homeowner improvement program that requires 50% match if you for helping about 20 households a year, and that is for the county, not just Hudson. But some of those other ones that they talked about, like Access Restore, there's some for veterans, some for mobile home park, they don't have that in there. But some of our like Rocco has. So there's more things on the table, and then you have to apply for those. Just because you're in that program, you're not allocated funds necessarily. You have to go after funds.
But we can't rule out that there are houses available for that entirely, because I know the Habitat houses all got that down payment assistance, which made a difference in that. But I think one of the things that this is identified is that we need to work more closely with identify our joint goals, the ways that we can work together to provide more access to more services in Columbia County.
Grants that.
Right.
Okay.
Chris, we can't hear those sidebar conversations.
Michelle Tullo from Hudson just kind of outlined there are a variety of RPCs in the area, but not all of their programs overlap. So if you're in an area where multiple RPCs are active, you may not be able to avail yourself of all of their offerings. Is that fair summation? Or if you want to come up, you can.
Can you hear me?
Is that better, Tim?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, that's why somebody said the audio is very poor on the chat thing, because we can't.
Oh, yeah, so just briefly, in terms of
Oh, there we go.
The RPC issue, they have a menu of services they offer that can be development, but also like different grants for housing, rehab, or down payment assistance. So Galvin has some of those. They don't have all of them that some of the other counties have. And then in terms of development, you can use, that's what I think what Meredith was asking, like you can use developers who are not our RPC. You could use Repco or Hudson River Housing, because that's separate than those programs for like rehab or down payment assistance. So it's a little more complicated than just, this is your county's person, these are the programs they have.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna start running through our committee report outs. Go ahead and get the agenda up for you.
Put a sign-in sheet on the corner for people to read for guests. Would that be useful, have a sign-in sheet for guests? Or is everybody here in for the advisory?
I know almost everyone in this room.
Does that mean that they're all members of the task force or the committee or the advisory committee?
No, but this one's open to the public, so people can come in.
That's why I was thinking sign-in sheet might be useful, so we can add them to our name.
We'll grab them at the end. We had it at the first meeting, and the only people that signed in were task force members.
Okay. Okay. I know when I defeated.
All right, so committee meetings, committee reports from the meetings. Starting with the outreach committee, one of the first things that we were talking about doing was a Faces of Affordable Housing series. There's some question about if we wanted to have a survey or if we just wanted to develop profiles of actual people. We kind of put a pin in the survey idea. The thought there was a survey will just collect data. we have all the data that I think we need to really make the case that we need more housing or more affordable housing in the county. So the survey is just going to be more work for information we already have. But Kelly Sweet and I spoke to Dr. Tim Wilmo over at Berkshire Taconic, who has put together a number of surveys for them. That's pretty much what he does. And he agreed that a survey for that specific reason wasn't necessary, but he also agreed that creating profiles of actual living, breathing people instead of sort of the composite profiles that you sometimes see would help from a narrative standpoint. You know, if you walk into a meeting and somebody says, hey, we don't want more affordable housing here, it's going to, increase crime, or, whatever the case may be, whatever the NIMBYism of that moment is, you can point to, here are 15 people that have master's degrees that, want to live in your neighborhood. You don't,
I'll be a poster person.
I'm a poster person. There are a few poster people in this room. Yeah, you don't have to look too far to find people that are having a hard time finding housing in the county. So we're still going to go forward with the phases of affordable housing from the profile perspective. So I'm collecting those stories. Some of these are people that have reached out to me through my email. Some are just conversations I've had around. I mean, every day I have a conversation with somebody who either is having a hard time living here or having a hard time finding a place here. Their rent just went up. So these are pretty easy profiles to collect. I do have the second bullet here, employer/employee survey on hold. During that same conversation with Dr. Wilma, we decided that employer survey actually made sense. A lot of the reports that you see talk about the impact of housing unaffordability on employers, but not many of those reports actually feature data or stories from the employers. So, a lot of these reports kind of speak on their behalf. So we want to reach out to employers to get their perspective. Questions like, have you changed your hours because you can't fill your staff? Have you had positions that went unfilled for a long time because you can't, there aren't enough people in the area? I just had a conversation 2 weeks ago. There's a town in the county that currently has an open position for some kind of highway employee. It's a full-time position. It pays $24,000 a year. So that person will never be able to afford to live in the county on their own. But that's a pretty common situation. So it's not just, we talk about nurses, not doctors, we talk about nurses, teachers, firefighters, things like that, but it's county employees and town employees who have a hard time living in the place where they work. Website. So there was a snafu. There was a bit of a hiccup with that, but we're all set. We have a web designer who is redesigning some of the parts of our website. I have a layout done for what our page will look like. So that just needs to get sent to them. And then I've got a few links to compile. Some of the things that we talked about being on the website were, acting as a portal to funding sources, acting as a portal to different presentations and different workshops that are coming up. So we'll have all of those on there. We'll kind of work through this in committee, in the outreach committee, what that will actually look like. But that should be getting going next week. We'll have a page that's live. Number 4 is neighboring county and town reps. So I'm speaking to Robert McKeon tomorrow, who is the town supervisor for Red Hook. I think I've talked about this a couple of times. Red Hook put together a program where the town itself purchased 110 acres of property right along Route 9, purchased it from the private market at the asking price. And they're going to carve out 10 acres of that for affordable housing that it looks like REPCO is going to develop. The interesting thing there is the funding sources that they use to make this purchase happen. They have a community preservation fund on the books down there. It's something that any community can adopt. It's state enabling legislation. Typically, those funds can only be used for conservation, or the exact letter of the law is maintaining the character of your community. They somehow managed to use some of those funds to acquire a parcel that some of it will be used for affordable housing. So I'm very curious about that. But Red Hook has a number they have inclusionary zoning down there. They've got quite a few strategies that I think we could learn from. So I've collected a few questions to pose to the supervisor tomorrow, and I'll report back on that to all of the committees next week. Really, it kind of falls under everybody's ambit. Greylock will put a pin on. Greylock is on there. Greylock has a program that offers very low interest loans to rental tenants to help them with their security deposit on the next space they move into. Not something that really gets talked a lot about when you talk about affordable housing, especially rural affordable housing. But people being unable to find new or better housing because they can't afford to pay their current rent and save up for a security deposit is a pretty big deal. Greylock has a program that is really successful in the Southern Berkshires around Great Barrington and Sheffield. So we're hoping we can get them to expand that here.
2019 tenants' rights law that I mentioned.
Yeah.
addresses that also. They reduce the amount of security.
They did. The enforcement on that is questionable. I spent the past 2 years looking for apartments throughout the county. I can't tell you how many landlords are still requiring 3 months payment upfront. Every single one of them, I told them you can either change your posting or I'll report you to the Attorney General's office.
Well, some of it is
You're
just
not
a
quite getting
big-
us how.
No,
You didn't get an apartment, did you?
I got an apartment. I found a responsible landlord.
It's interesting because as a landlord, I interface with a lot of landlords. A remarkable number of them just have no idea.
That's part of it.
I mean, part of it is just, you see listings and you drop a note to the guy offline and say, hey, bud, you're in violation of law here.
My email
Very
was.
often it changes.
It'll change. Yeah, my email was kind of 2 parts. It was, I assume you don't know this already. Here's this law that passed. I'll check back in a week and see if anything's changed. And if not, I'll call the cops. Number 6 on outreach, and this will come back. This is on, I think, at least 2 of our committee's agendas. It's to solicit towns for toolbox item priorities. So there's a bit of a pivot that you'll see in the red there, the strategy pivot. At first, we were thinking about actually creating these toolbox items. Complete waste of time, I think. These exist everywhere. These resources are all over the place. They were literally created to be shared with towns and counties and villages. There's no need to recreate them. We can aggregate them. What Nan Stolzenberg, who has created a pretty robust set of planning and housing toolbox items, what she's going to come talk to us about next month is, I think, where really the rubber meets the road on this is these things exist. Some of these have been out there for 15 to 20 years. How can smaller towns avail themselves of these programs? So that'll be the topic of next month's meeting and how I think we should approach the toolbox items. We actually did something similar at Berkshire Regional Planning Commission when I was there. That's one of the RPAs that gets that money from the state that I was talking about. And it didn't get finished before I left, but the idea was to take all of the housing toolbox items, have them live in one place, and then have a bit of a menu. So if you were a town supervisor or on a planning board and you said, hey, here's the issue that I want to address, you would be able to type that in and you would get a result that said, here are the X amount of toolbox items that apply to that specific issue. So that's the end goal of that.
So related to outreach.
Yes.
And as we just heard today, New York State says that 5,000 in their mind is rural. So our entire Columbia County, all the communities
Everything's rural.
are rural. So, and I think narrative is a super important aspect to outreach, and especially with the concern from people not in my backyard kind of reaction. I think it should be clear that we are a rural housing task force because there is not a single part of Columbia County that doesn't fall under that definition.
Yeah, and I think, Mike mentioned that there are varying definitions for what's rural, right? USDA has its own, NYSERDA has its own, the state has its own. So you have to be careful because I don't want it to come up where we're calling something rural and then programs available for, so I just want to make sure that we have the opportunity to apply for any grant funds that we possibly can.
I get that.
But yes, I think having rural in there is vitally important.
Well, I understand that. I just think it really is important because it really, I think, is what makes our situation unique. Because we are so close to New York City, so close to Albany, so close to Boston. But even by New York State standards, our entire county is rural. So, for me, I think that really, I thought this presentation was excellent.
And I know for the USD, Columbia County, because of its rural status, all towns are eligible for other USD funds. So that's another.
Okay, and then just to tie that up, so soliciting the towns for toolbox item priorities. We've heard from 6 of the 18 towns so far. And we've got a list you'll see on the next committee assignments. You'll see which have been the most requested toolbox items so far, but we still need to reach out to the rest of the towns. And as we get through this, I'm going to ask task force members to pay special attention to the bolded next steps. These are what we're calling task force opportunities. I've had, all credit to you guys I haven't ever worked with a volunteer board that's consistently asked me, what can I do? Give me work. So you guys get to pick what work you want. These are task force opportunities.
We're surprised somebody else is doing some of the work. We're doing it all.
So we'll circle back to that, but the next step for that is to reach out to the towns that we haven't heard from yet, or to double check if towns, have changed their minds and say, hey, we want to pursue, inclusionary zoning or whatever the case may be. So that was outreach. Policy committee. So speaking of, here are the priority items for the toolbox. And this, again, this is aggregation, not creation, right? So the first 6 that we were going to look at were ADUs, accessory dwelling units, inclusionary zoning, community land trusts, a housing trust fund, either upzoning or an overlay district. So upzoning is just allowing more density in a certain, whatever the zone may be. Instead of it just being single families, now you've got singles and twos. That's the easiest one. And then overlay districts, that is, you've got your underlying zoning district, whether it's B2, B3, R1, whatever. You create a special district on top of it, and only within that, that's the overlay. Within that overlay, there are different zoning codes. And usually it involves upzoning, but it can be a variety of things, like mixed use is allowed here when it wasn't before, but you still have the underlying zoning code still stays there. This just kind of rests on top of it. And then the 6th one is the missing middle / gentle density concept that I think we're all pretty well familiar with so far. Missing middle is talking about things like, honestly, in the county, it's duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, those are missing middle. It also kind of refers to the middle income. So homes for people at that middle income, which is right around the median. We've got a real surfeit of those. So those 4 highlighted items were the ones that the most towns were interested in. So those have become the priority. So these 6 will be the first ones that go up on the website. And we just need to reach out to more of the towns. We did have, in addition, within the task force, which was cluster zoning. So we'll have that up as well. And the next step is the next line item here. Initially it was create first 6 toolbox items. We crossed that out because we're not creating these, we're just aggregating them. And then we've already got our priorities established. And the next step is to literally just post them to the new site page, which should be up and running next week. And then we still need to canvass the rest of the towns for the next set. You want to sign up for that one? Number 3 is to collect examples of currently existing gentle density / missing middle. I've talked about this a couple of times. There are quite a few properties out there throughout the county that just look like a big house that are actually apartments. Getting our hands around how many of those are out there, where they exist, what they look like, that's going to go a long way towards kind of easing missing middle and gentle density into the conversation if people know that these things already exist in their communities and they just aren't aware of it. I could use help with that one too. If anybody wants to really dig into parcel data.
If there's a place that we can send suggestions.
There is, we have Google Drives set up for each committee. I think I need to reiterate that they're out there and resend them. Right. So I'll make those Google Drives available to everybody. So they won't be kind of siloed by committee members since there's so much crossover. And committee members always, if you guys want to crash a committee meeting that you're not a part of, feel free, let me know. But I'll expand those Google Drive invitations so everybody has access to each of those folders. So we looked at, in the past month, I looked at recent comp plan updates. When you see the list there of the recent ones, Austerlitz, Chatham, Claremont, Gallatin, Hudson, these are either recently done or underway or about to get underway, kind of gearing up. So the next step, and Mike mentioned this during his presentation, was how out of date a lot of the comp plans are and a lot of the zoning codes are. So the next step in this is to go through the towns and see what the most recent zoning changes were that pertain to housing development. That's going to be a big lift. But that's kind of, that's my world, so I'm happy to take that on. But there are 18 towns, and some of these zoning codes are 300 pages long.
Any zoning code update is going to go through the Columbia County Planning Board, so if we should share some of that,
True.
You know who would be an excellent resource for that?
Yes.
Man could probably rattle them off. Just as an add to this, get agreed at the last beginning process. So we're sending out an RFP for So,
For comp plan? Great.
probably get it created next.
Are you guys going to, do you know if they're going to create committees for each kind of section of the comp plan, or will it just be one committee for the comp plan? Okay.
My guess is there will be some subcommittees, but I don't.
Okay.
Hope to God I will get
We
it.
use Michael Allen. We did focus groups for some of the stuff like housing,
Yeah.
agriculture, things like that.
Does he work with Lynn or is he a separate?
They used to work together, and I think they still meet.
Mike Allen?
Michael Allen is from Regrowth Planning.
Regrowth. Okay, thank you.
We just have droves of people who find townhouses, gas lights, so.
All right, so the next one under policy was to research dedicated funding sources and structures. So we talked about things like a short-term rental fee, which Hudson has, and obviously there's legislation at the state level that just might come down at some point. But part of the conversation tomorrow with Bob McKean down in Red Hook is to examine, it's a broader conversation about looking at the use of fees throughout the regions, not just our county, but Ulster County, Greene County, whatever the case may be. And since they've had recently quite a bit of success using kind of alternative fees, I'm going to open up that conversation with them. I'll report that back to policy and to the full group once we have a better handle on it. But there are a number of interesting structures out there that I think we could learn a lot from. And we don't have to copy them one for one, but these are just to kind of, put more tools in the toolbox per se.
Doesn't Vermont have a mortgage tax that goes into, that funds their affordable?
That funds therefore, they do.
Yes. 0.5%.
Well, we're doing, New York State does.
We're doing a
Oh,
community.
yeah.
We have
preservation.
that, yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
What's the percentage?
I only know the transfer tax.
That's
percentage,
right.
I don't know the mortgage tax. Transfer
To the
tax
buyer.
is 0.4% to the state, with an additional 1.4% to the city.
It's
That's
gotta go to the
transfer
ballot in
tax
November,
paid by the
but
seller.
Will you do it in
Vermont's
November?
mortgage also carries the tax.
Chris, did you
Just
hear that?
amendments, yeah.
Chris,
updates
did you
here and
hear
there. I do.
Chatham is doing a community presentation in November.
Oh, fantastic. But so that's for conservation.
with agriculture being the emphasis,
Right.
then, open space, wetlands and things like that. But I can see how Red Hook can take that, that fund and do that, because that's conservation subdivision pretty much.
Right.
It's consolidating housing to preserve open space. But yeah, we're gonna try to get that passed with it's a maximum 2% real estate transfer tax on any sale price over the county median.
You go for that. For all-
Yeah,
all
that's,
counties.
No, they're gonna try
One more
to make
time.
this more universal. We had enabling legislation from 2007 that no one acted on. We're trying to get done because you need to show some success before getting reauthorized after 20 years. So we're right on the cusp of that. So we're trying to get this through. But yeah, it's
So can you repeat that? It's 2% tax,
up to 2%.
up
So.
to 2%.
on anything
So the
above,
board has to approve, they have to adopt a community preservation plan, a community preservation fund and advisory board, and a real estate transfer tax. So there's like three things. But we had enabling legislation, but there is discussions with like Scenic Hudson where they are gonna try to make this universal across the state to allow this to proceed without special enabling legislation.
But right now, it is targeting Hudson Valley legislation.
Yeah, so basically Dew Falls, Gardner, Marbletown are the recent ones. Red Hook is so far ahead of
Yeah.
us on a lot of things, but they got their enabling legislation the same time we did, but they turned right around and passed everything. So they,
Just a quick, do they use that on infrastructure?
I haven't seen their spending. I think a lot of it is agricultural land preservation and purchase of development rights, which is what our focus would be. But
there is if you want to look
So
at how
there's
they,
a Speaker for someone from Scenic Hudson to come in and talk about this.
yeah, we could.
That's a game changer.
yeah, there's a woman named Cara from Scenic who worked through all that.
If you want to take a look at an example of what the community preservation plan looks like, Red Hooks is online. It's about 167 pages long. I mean, you have to have the plan before you can adopt it, right? I believe that's the
So you
process.
adopt
You have to
the plan.
create the plan
Yeah,
before
we're
you can
actually
adopt
probably
it.
gonna adopt the plan or the fund at the same time, but the real estate transfer tax is a little bit of a lag. But, our plan has a land evaluation in it, because we're trying to prioritize agriculture, so we're looking at each parcel in the town for soil, for proximity to wetland, things of that nature, but we had a lot of help from Ingrid Heckel at CEDC, Hudson River Estuary Program. And like I said, the small group, it still has to go, to the ballot.
Is the preservation fund entirely funded by the transfer fund?
It can receive gifts. It can also be used as matching. So you can actually receive not only monetary, but land. through that. I don't think the town wants to become a land board, but if someone were to have no heirs and want to donate land, I think that's a good way for the town to do it.
DLC contributes to towns that have these funds, so that you can jointly, like the Dutch Land Conservancy.
Yeah, you
You
have to
can
work with the
jointly
land
go
boards.
after these development rights, so the town could put in 100,000, they may put in. So it's really important.
And then our last piece in policy was an impact study on the Ulster Housing Smart Communities Initiative. So Ulster has exactly that, Housing Smart Communities Initiative. It's modeled on the Climate Smart Communities Initiative, which shouts to all the newly medaled climate smart communities throughout the county. Quite a few, actually. 6.
We got 39% in the last round of bronze certifications. I don't know if you saw that.
I did, yeah.
39%.
So they modeled a housing program based on that. It's a little bit early to get at the an impact of what that is. They just rolled it out in October, but they've already had almost half of the towns sign up for it. And this is a program that it offers incentives from the county to towns who adopt different types of approaches to developing housing. And again, it's a little bit early. So the idea now is to speak to towns individually instead of just like the overall county viewpoint. At this one will be more one-on-one conversations with individual towns just to gauge interest in that, which is similar to how Ulster County rolled theirs out. They had Ulster County's version of Me basically sold this program one by one to all of the towns before they really rolled it out. So it was a series of conversations that took them about 8 months. But the buy-in that they've had so far is really impressive. So that takes us through policy. Pre-development's got kind of a lot going on this month, I'll be honest. But again, pre-development, as always, the caveat is that some of these things have a longer tail than the other things. The website will be live next week. Some of these pre-development things are going to take months, if not a year, to get through. But we'll start at the beginning. So the first thing we talked about doing was a parcel audit, especially looking for existing large one-bedroom homes that could be converted. I think the next step on this is to continue to build out the portfolio of parcels that make sense potentially for development. Obviously, we don't want to get into situations where somebody is living in a home that they've had for 45 years, and we're like, hey, this looks great. You should turn this into a multi-unit. So we're staying away from that. So we're really looking at vacant properties, properties that are in arrears, just fully vacant parcels. So just a parcel that has nothing on it, but that is flat, either hooked up to or close to infrastructure to reduce those costs. The next thing, I don't have it on here because it just came up today, but I think this is going to be a really interesting kind of approach. Taking a look at package sewer systems, these things that just exist outside of county or town infrastructure that only exist within development or on the parcel where the homes are located. What we're going to do is take a look at what the breakpoint is. How many units do you need for that to make financial sense, where it's not just another thing that costs more money than you're going to get back when you finally sell one of these properties. And then from there, figuring, okay, how big does the leach field need to be? What does the soil have to look like? And then figuring out what parcels we have from the audit list that match up with that. So you're kind of creating, it's like that matrix that we talked about of parcels that can be developed, but this is adding the packet septic to it, because that's going to be another expense, and that expense is going to change based on the conditions of individual parcels.
Is that going to be limited to rentals or to development
No.
with homeowner association?
Yes, yes.
Have
Lately,
individual ownership?
correct. Yeah, lately I've become a really big proponent of rural condos as a method to address housing issues.
Don't have it.
Yeah, and I think it makes a lot of sense because you're building you're still getting a gentle density, right? So you can have a condo unit that's just, or a condo conglomeration. That's just 4 units. So you can get down to that 4 to 6 number. But you do have the homeowner association. So you have the diffused payment of the septic system. You've got kind of another layer of local management of these units. You know, if someday they are on land that's owned by a nonprofit, there's the homeowner association and the nonprofit that's holding that land both have vested interest in the property. So, you know, property maintenance will be kept up. But there's quite a bit of funding out there for multifamily affordable home ownership developments and not a lot of applications for it. So there's a lot of money sitting on the table for that.
But can I just mention this number about 5 versus 4?
Yeah, I think I know where that comes from.
Well, National Association of Home Builders, it has to be 4 for this. So when the state goes to 5, you're pushing out that organization that would normally contribute to this discussion.
Some of the towns, if you look at some definitions of multifamily versus apartments, that's the break point between 4 and 5. So, right. Yeah.
That's like real loss water. They go.
CERDI used to go down to 4. When that first rolled out, it was down to 4. It changed. It used to be 4 to 20.
We're losing the huge organization by not knowing that.
Yeah, I don't know why they added the X. Well, I know why they did.
But that could be one of the things that could be coordinated is we're making zoning changes, and understanding how these things function. Sure that those zoning changes are aligned with funding sources.
Right. So if your definition of multi-unit starts at 4 instead of 5, it's like, okay, there are some things that you're not going to be eligible for based on their definition, but there are other things that you will be based on. So yeah, that I think, and that's going to come down to things like where do you want 4s, where do you want 5s? That'll come down to things like overlay districts and zoning amendments. Okay, compile project-specific funding sources. So this is going to be the portal that lives on the website page that links out to things like HDR's programs, USDA's programs, NYSERDA's programs. And again, I think our role there is not just to share the information, but also to kind of match up specific programs with what towns are trying to do. So some of that is going to be actually asking the towns, what are your goals? And then we can help them find the appropriate program for it. The create matrix that matches property types, funding opportunities, that kind of goes back to number 2 here, but also that packet septic idea. Survey developers for barriers to development within the next probably 3 weeks or so. We're going to invite some smaller scale developers to come into the office here. And whoever wants to be a part of that conversation is welcome to come. The idea there is to gauge what their biggest barriers have been. Obviously, infrastructure is going to be number 1. I think a few are just going to be, okay, we know these are issues, right? But what are issues that we can fix easily and quickly? There might be some things that developers are really hung up on that we could address pretty quickly.
Are you speaking?
I haven't really curated the list
So
yet.
you should put down Collaborative Home Builders. They're trying to develop it in Vermont. That's a climate smart development. And they're close, but they would have a lot.
Are they a nonprofit or no? They're not a nonprofit, are they?
No,
They're for profit.
they have a brother.
Are you talking to market rate
Both.
builders or?
Yeah, both. Just because, and especially for things like that, though, so if you're a for-profit developer, if you JV'd with a nonprofit, there's, all right, if you did a joint venture development with a nonprofit partner, there is money out there through HCR for climate smart buildings, and it's a lot. The subsidy is $100,000 a unit.
And they have sites, small sites,
Right.
right next to their development.
Yeah, so that could be a winning partnership. I know there are a variety of developers throughout the area that are looking at that. I don't know what the full pot of money is. I know that for that particular program, once it hits $15 million in grants made in the city's done. But I don't know what the full pot is or how much they're setting aside for the county. Yeah, I know.
You say they have small sites near the development, sites of what?
And small home sites, right? They have a subdivision right next to their development. They've parcel that is never been developed. And it's a subdivision right next to it with small available lots in it. Those lots are deal. But they're like any home builder, they're for sale. It's for sale. And it's public septic, public water septic.
How far from the main street?
It's so bad to like describe things, but Well, you know where the water. Exactly. It's right at that. And
Is it the one up the hill?
That's the one they're
Oh, I know.
about.
right,
I don't want to see it.
everybody's
You know,
complaining about it. The problem with any home builders, they would be afraid to bring in affordable housing to their proposal. It's looking too much pushback. But if they knew that they had resources going to support a group like us, now they might go for it.
Right. I mean, it's just how, available housing, attainable housing, whatever you call it. Accessible. Okay, so invite developers forum. Number 5 on pre-development was to develop a scope for the feasibility build-out analysis. And I think that ties right back into the packet septic idea. So actually, we'll see what the scope of that is. That's probably something that we're going to have to get technical assistance funding for and hire out a third-party consultant to put that together. Some of that's going to involve soils testing. Some of that's going to involve figuring out how much acreage you need for a certain amount of units. So that might be a third-party strategy there. Number 6 is kind of an organizational study. Really, this is a process study. There's a Dutchess County / Poughkeepsie Housing Trust Fund. This was also really interesting. It's about as interesting as the Red Hook initiative. So it was clearly ARPA money. Once you find out how big the Housing Trust Fund was capitalized at, they started off at $12 million. So they decided to start a housing trust fund, formed a housing trust fund, and pushed $9 million through that trust fund, all in the span of 6 months. By the time I read about the housing trust fund being created, they already had applications in. And then 3 days later, I read that they were already pushing things out. So they moved really quickly. ARPA funds are obviously kind of like a golden goose situation, but they have recurring funding sources already set up. That's kind of the idea of housing trust funds. Some towns, counties, communities have a line item in their budgets for affordable housing. Housing trust funds are meant to replace that. Some communities don't have that line item, and housing trust funds can create that, but it needs to be a recurring source. That's the point. A lot of them are funded by transfer fees. A lot are funded literally just by donations. They can acquire grants. So there's a number of ways to fund them. ARPA is the best way to fund them apparently, but I don't think there's any more of that money coming. Yeah,
Right, one time.
pretty much. I mean, kind of hopefully, right? But hope we don't have to recover from that again.
We haven't gotten Bill yet.
And then the strategy study is just kind of, again, that goes back to the Red Hook conversation I'll be having tomorrow. And number 8 was added late. So we had a fact-finding conversation with Christopher Watts, right?
Yeah.
Christopher, thank you. Who is the county attorney who handles the foreclosure process. Really just trying to get our heads around how the foreclosure process works in the county. The county is a foreclosing governmental unit for everybody except for Hudson, right? Hudson does their own. In different FGUs is the abbreviation for that, foreclosing governmental unit. So there are different processes. Columbia County takes title after 2 years, which is actually better than a lot of. I'm used to 3 years. That's what Rensselaer County and the city of Troy both did when I was dealing with foreclosures. Typically, the process is a sealed bid process. Looks like the next round is going to be an online auction. Part of that, I think, is because there's a backlog. There were no foreclosure sales one round. Is that right, Brenda? 2021, I think. 20, yeah. Right. Yeah, so there are no, it's not that there weren't any sales, it's just the county stopped taking, the county stopped taking titles. Right.
There is litigation working up through the federal courts that will change that equation.
Yes. Extremely. May not be involved in it at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I'm happy to be involved in that a little bit more, Chris. As a supervisor, I've been involved in that for the last 12 years or so with the county foreclosure process. And 15 years ago, we were really behind the 8 ball because of staffing. We just didn't do it, and then we got the ball rolling. Former Chairman Grattan, who was attorney, did some of that stuff. He really got that stepped up for us, and we did a good job for a number of years. And like Brenda said, until COVID came along, but we had really gotten that where we were doing in-house marketing of the foreclosed properties. And I can tell you that you know, much like this committee keeps talking about, that there are delinquent properties out there. We were doing a very good job of taking those delinquent properties and foreclosing on them and selling them to developers for taking them, flipping them, and, you know, turning them into housing, you know, which is our goal here. Right, you know, I think that happened a lot. Then COVID happened and we haven't done it all, you know, so now it's all changing. We've lost some staff that used to market them for us. So yeah, I've been involved in that for years. You know, be happy to be.
The auction will be highly advertised. There's a
Right.
deep
Yeah.
list for.
Oh, yeah, no, that, and, you know, that'll do it, but it's really the court action. And as Bob references, I don't know if you know, but I mean, the county is always, you know, if you had properties, you know, say that we had, you know, 5 properties and, you know, we were owed $100,000 on them and we could sell all them, you'd win on some and lose on some, you know.
Yeah.
And
Comes out
basically,
wash.
we would come out and he would recoup the taxpayers' dollars and usually fund the operation of that, you know, through a small amount of sale revenues. But there is legislation that may take any of that money away from us, you know. So I think the way I'm seeing that, either the county's going to have to restructure it to have a better tracking of fees, the work that went into it from county staff, to recoup the money that, you know, the county attorney's office goes through to do all that, or you're just not going to do it. I don't know. You know, I don't know, the scary outcome of that. Because,
So
Yeah.
one of the things that I was always curious about as a relatively new supervisor is how many of those properties rolled over, you know, in 3 to 5 years and came back for delinquent taxes a second time.
yeah, there's a list of those, but it's not many. I really think that the majority of them, you know, and I say majority because there's always an exception, but the majority of those did get bought and fixed up and they became sustainable, you know, homes. You look at them, I've watched it for years.
I'm just thinking about some kind of a capture clause that if somebody does renege or if it does come back, that in the event that we had our land bank, it could be banked for development as opposed to having that churn roll over and over.
I think you have to watch them, and again, I mean, we've been involved in, you know, that, you know, like Rob Lopez from 911 was looking for, you know, locations for towers around the county, so, you know, every time properties became available, you would look at them to try and tie those in, and I think that there is value in that, and, you know, we talk about mobile home parks, you know, I think the department would have loved to have a mobile home park to put people in, you know, we looked at things like that over the years. Is there an ideal foreclosure? But most of them get sold and become profitable.
So I'm not questioning the past practices, but I just want to make sure that a land bank is in the equation for future discussion. That's all.
It can certainly be a discussion. I want to see what the goal of it is, and you know, I mean, to me, you know, Hudson wrestles with watching Galvin, but Galvin said, you know, they have collected properties to try and get a city block to them, and that's a different situation than what we see in Canaan or Chatham. You know, when you have a foreclosed property on 2 acres out in the backwoods, you know.
Usually in my case, it's landlocked.
Yeah, it's landlocked or something, but I mean, it's not gonna be an advantageous thing to save that, wait for the next lot to become available, you know, which is.
So one of the questions, we talked about land banks and land banking pretty early and kind of extensively. So I think what it came down to was, do you need a land bank to bank land? And the answer was no.
So
Right.
land trust.
Right.
Land
It could be
trust,
anything that can
whatever
hold
vehicle
land.
it is, I'm
Right.
not fixed on a specific vehicle.
Right.
I like the idea of trust because there's much more that trust can do other than bank rate.
Now, from a real kind of, I want to say pessimistic, there's money for land banks right now and there isn't for community land trusts, right? So that creates a bit of a wrinkle, but I don't think you want to create a new organization with, you know, an extra layer of administration just because funds are available for it. I think funds might get into the budget next year for CLTs. It sounds like it might be their turn again.
But CLTs, the number of CLTs are limited by the state, right?
Number of land banks are limited by the state.
Banks, not.
Correct. Yeah. And it started off at 10 and then they raised the cap to
Doubled.
15 and now I believe it's at 30.
Right.
And there are 28 currently operating. I think there's room for 2 left.
So one of the things that
Oh,
I
hang on,
think is,
Meredith. One sec, sorry. Go ahead, Dennis.
Sure.
Oh, go ahead, Meredith. Dennis, cede the
okay,
floor.
so one of the things that I think is an interesting thing to look at about the foreclosed properties is whether they can be sold on a restricted basis. So with a direction and a restriction to use them for affordable housing, workforce housing. So that would by definition mean the price would be lower, would reflect what using it for affordable housing. Maybe we could even, if we've got a list of the state resources that are available to help fund renovation of housing for affordable housing, we can make that available along with the sale. But it would be great to instead of simply recycling these properties back, that could become affordable housing, and certainly, will become housing of some sort. But it would be great to take this resource and be able to direct it specifically towards the kind of affordable workforce housing that we've been looking at.
This is what I'm saying. I think there's banking land versus land banks, and exactly what she's saying is that if you want to create a kind of covenant or a kind of restriction of what these parcels would be used for, you need time. So the purpose of creating some kind of bank of land is to give you the time to do that, to create the restrictions or to create the covenants or the easements and when we're talking about the state, they're mostly interested in sizable developments. They are now open to the idea of scattered sites. They don't all have to be, block next to block. So again, in order to get 5 sites to have potentially 2 family homes on each, you need time. So I think one of the things I'd like to emphasize is that, as you're saying, we're not going to solve this in a year. We need to have ideas that will work for 10 years from now, ideas that will work for 12 years from now. And that's why you need vehicles like that allow you to bank land to get that time. Because with when you have foreclosures and they just sell again, you don't have the time to come up with those kind of strategies.
Right. So the question is who holds the land, right? So whether it's because I don't know that there's precedent in the state for foreclosure sales being made with a deed restriction, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. I'm very aware of nonprofits purchasing foreclosures, and then when they sell whatever's on the property, they impose the deed restriction.
Right,
that I'm very used to.
Partnerships to create something like that. That's what I'm saying. It's like it doesn't have to be, the land bank policy of New York State. We're talking. That's what I want to be clear about. That talking about banking land is not necessarily talking about New York State policy.
Right. So I don't think you need to create a new organization, but there just needs to be an organization that does hold the property until it's ready to be developed.
Right.
And
there
that's
might be some organizations that don't but there might be organizations that do hold property, like conservation organizations.
Right.
That just don't realize there's an opportunity for them to participate. And I will tell you, conservation organizations right now, the hot topic is workforce housing. I mean, they know they have to tackle this issue. So there are other organizations that could serve as partners to hold these foreclosures.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for CLC since nobody from CLC is on the call, but they've been at the table about these conversations. They're willing partners. So they're willing partners. The discussions are if they've got land on the disposition side, right? Land conservancies traditionally, if they're going to acquire land, have to acquire it for their purpose. So if they're picking up new land, traditionally it has to be used for conservation, but that doesn't mean that that's what it always has to be used for.
My understanding of CLC, I don't want to speak for them, but my understanding is that they could be interested in structures.
Right. So vacant parcels, yeah. So they could hold on to that and then just divest themselves out. Yeah.
Brenda and I, we worked on a piece of land that they were holding. It was completely inappropriate to use in any way for agricultural purposes, but they were holding it so eventually habitat could develop it. So, so they don't want to go outside their mission. We understand that.
Right.
We don't have to expect them to do that, but they might be able to see a way of being this kind of partner that hold land for when another organization can make use of it for accessible housing.
That is everything Kelly said goodbye quite a while ago, actually.
So the other thing I just wanted
home sharing. That's what
Yes.
this group, and I'm not sure which committee you want to fit it into. We are trying to do a pilot for home sharing. We're working with various organizations now. So we can find out home sharing is typically a senior in a large home that they don't need all of that space, but it's also become expensive to maintain. There's taxes or maintenance, and you share your home. So sharing. No, you don't.
No.
There's not a rent necessarily. It might be someone chopping off or grows your grass, but it is a mutually beneficial situation. And it's a federally accredited program, and for not for lives, successfully for years. And somebody has to bet.
They do.
Somebody has to bet. You know, up to both sides. Whether they know
And some of them,
Is there an agency?
We found about 4 agencies that we're reviewing in terms of finding a fit for Columbia County. But I think the question is, all of these models are very similar, and it's just a question of tailoring and finding either agency or not-for-profit.
and some of the home sharing, so when you look at, I started to review some of that, that's a lot of material you guys had from that meeting. Some of the home sharing arrangements, the person who doesn't own the home pays either, some of them are nothing, depending on how much work they do around the home. The agreements are usually somewhere between 10 to 12 hours of like chores, really, right? Like, you know, you do the dishes, just little things. And even the top end, and most of that literature was like $600 a month for the person that was the sherry. The guest. Yeah,
I couldn't tell who it was who was talking about home sharing, but I'm on the board of an organization that is based in New York City that has got a big and very successful home sharing program in New York City. And I know the people who run it would be happy to talk to, whoever is interested in doing it in Columbia County. So whoever it was, I don't know if that was Brenda or somebody else.
It was Brenda.
Brenda, you know what? If you just want to get in touch with me, Meredith, offline, I'd be happy to put you in touch with the New York Foundation for Senior Citizens, which is the organization that I'm on the board of that has got a great program in this area.
Okay, did you hear that? All right, 5:34. I kept you guys past 90 minutes. I broke my promise. So I've got a few committee opportunities already fulfilled. I'll send around a list with what else is left.
I tried to prime the pump.
I know. That's right. I'll figure out who I think makes the most sense and see if we got that capacity. All right, that'll do it. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you all.